Okay, this is the last portion of our lecture video. There's Millard Fillmore, so he just took over as president. I know he looks a little bit like Alec Baldwin. All right, let's talk about the Compromise of 1850. So in its final version, the Compromise of 1850 included the following elements. First, California entered the Union as a free state, ending forever the balance between free and slave states. The Texas-New Mexico Act made New Mexico a separate territory and set the present Texas state boundary. The Utah Act set up the Utah Territory and gave the territorial legislature authority over, quote, all rightful subjects of legislation, including slavery. A Fugitive Slave Act, that was the fourth item, required the federal government and northern states to help capture and return runaway slaves to the South. As a gesture to anti-slavery groups, the public sale of slaves, but not slavery itself, was abolished in the District of Columbia, that is Washington, D.C. As President Fillmore signed the last of the measures into law, he claimed that they represented a final settlement to the sectional tensions over slavery. Many Americans agreed. Harmony is secured, patriots rejoice, trumpeted one newspaper. Henry Clay predicted that his solution would, quote, pacify, tranquilize, and harmonize the country. The Compromise of 1850, however, was not so much an example of warring people making concessions as it was a temporary and imperfect truce over the future of slavery. Extremists on both sides vowed to defy it. In the end, the Compromise only postponed secession and civil war for 10 years. Soon, aspects of the Compromise would reignite sectional tensions. Within 2 months of the passage of the Compromise of 1850, the squabbling between the North and South resumed. The Fugitive Slave Act was the most controversial element of the Compromise of 1850. It did more than strengthen the hand of slave catchers. It sought to recover slaves who had already escaped months or years before and considered themselves safe. It also inspired unscrupulous slave traders to kidnap free blacks in northern free states, claiming that they were runaway slaves. The law denied fugitives a jury trial and forced citizens to help locate and capture runaways. Abolitionists like Ralph Waldo Emerson were furious. Emerson urged people to break the new law, quote, on the earliest occasion. The mere existence of the Fugitive Slave Act was intolerable to many Northern abolitionists, several of whom advocated violence. The only way to make the Fugitive Slave Act law a dead letter, Frederick Douglass threatened, is to make half a dozen or more dead kidnappers. In Springfield, Massachusetts, fiery abolitionist John Brown formed an armed band of African Americans called the League of Gileadites to attack slave catchers. Such efforts led Horace Greeley, a prominent New York newspaper editor, to write that the Fugitive Slave Act was, quote, a very bad investment for slaveholders, because it was creating such a backlash against slavery throughout the northern states. In 1852, it took the Democrats 49 ballots before they chose Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire as their presidential candidate. When Pierce heard the results, he was stunned. "You are looking at the most surprised man who ever lived," he said. The Democrats' platform endorsed the Compromise of 1850, including enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act. Pierce became president. Pierce promoted Western expansion and the conversion of more territories to states, even if it meant adding more slave states to the Union. However, he also urged the North and South to avoid aggravating each other. Pierce was an intelligent man capable of eloquent speech-making, but he had tragic flaws and private demons. Blinded by a desire to be liked and cursed with raging ambition, he was a timid, indecisive leader who was often drunk. He would die in 1869 of alcoholism. By the end of his first year in office, Democratic leaders had decided he was a failure. In 1852 and 1853, Congress considered several proposals for a transcontinental rail line. Secretary of War Jefferson Davis of Mississippi favored a southern route across the territories acquired from Mexico. Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois insisted that Chicago be the Midwest hub for the new rail line and urged Congress to pass the Kansas-Nebraska Act so that the territory west of Mississippi and Iowa could be settled. Douglas championed the idea of popular sovereignty, whereby voters in each new territory would decide whether to allow slavery. It was a clever way to get around the 1820 Missouri Compromise, which banned slavery north of the 36th parallel, where Kansas and Nebraska were located. Southerners demanded more, however, and Douglas complied, in part because he would make a fortune if the bill passed, because he owned property needed by a transcontinental railroad. He supported the South in recommending the formal repeal of the Missouri Compromise and the creation of two territorial governments rather than one: Kansas, west of Missouri, and Nebraska, west of Iowa and Minnesota. This meant that millions of fertile acres would be opened to slaveholders. In May 1854, Douglas convinced both Democrats and Southern Whigs to pass the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The measure was approved by a vote of 37 to 14 in the Senate and 113 to 100 in the House. The anti-slavery faction in Congress, mostly Whigs, had been crushed, and the National Whig Party essentially died with them. Out of its ashes would emerge a new party, the Republicans. Thanks to Douglas's energetic leadership, the Kansas-Nebraska Act became law, but it shattered the Democratic Party's unity. Even as Congress debated, protest meetings sprang up throughout the North. So we will talk about the further political, social, and economic impacts of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and increasing sectionalism next week. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me.